as an indicator of something. So your question might be, what's the availability of forest resources in different parts of the world? And you could use this indicator to say, well, in Latin American, Caribbean, and tropical Africa, South and Southeast Asia, the amount of forest resources is going down a lot. That here in East Asia, it's increasing greatly. But your question might actually be, what's the progress in forest conservation in different parts of the world? And this would be indicating that some regions of the world are not doing very effectively in conserving forests because they're losing it, and others are stable and others are increasing, if that's your question. But this data is just an indicator to help you answer that question. It doesn't tell you the whole picture. Or maybe, actually, what you want to look at is the intensity of threats to forest ecosystems. That's your question. What are the intensity of threats? And so this data would help you with looking at that. Or actually, you could be saying, what's the investment in forest plantations in different parts of the world? And actually, most of the increase in forest area in East Asia is because of forest plantations in China. This data is just on forest area. It includes natural forests and plantation forests, not separated out. So maybe this data isn't very useful for that question, but it might give me an indicator to help you look at it. These days, climate change, we're interested in forest carbon sequestration. So this could be an indicator of whether there is sequestration or release of carbon from forests in different parts of the world. Or maybe your question is actually, what's the conservation status of forest-dependent species? Species that are only found in forests, their status is likely to get worse in Latin America and Caribbean and tropical Africa and South and Southeast Asia. They're losing forests. But this is just forest cover. This is actually, to know any more about forest-dependent species, this information is only a start. It's just an indicator. So the message is, from this, be clear, what is the question you're asking? What is the purpose that you have for which you need indicators? And then you can develop the indicators for that, identify the data that you need for that, and how to interpret that data to help you answer that question. Just another simple point to make in this, that when we talk about indicators, we often think of graphs and lines change over time. That's the most usual way. But that also indicators can be presented spatially on maps, or a combination of those. And in the Africa experiences report that you've got, there are different examples of that. Just want you to remember that always, that don't just think of a line graph when we talk about indicators. Think about maps as well, and perhaps how you can combine those. You can even include change in time with maps by different maps at different dates, different time periods. So, what makes a successful indicator? This cartoon here at the top, he says, wow, look at all these figures, something is definitely happening. The other guy says, what? He says, I just told you something. It's like, so often there may be data, lots and lots of data, but what does it mean? What do we do with it? And what we're interested in capacity building is having successful indicators. So what makes a successful indicator? So what I'm going to give you now are just some of the things that we found and that people have reported in the workshops that we've done. They said there's more on this in the guidance documents that we've given you. But one is that they're scientifically valid. Could somebody perhaps say, what do we mean by scientifically valid for an indicator? Could somebody explain that for us a little bit? Anybody like to say?
Not questionable from a scientific point of view.
Okay, Tristan, sorry, can you help us with the microphone? Yeah.
Just very brief.
Yes.
Not questionable, but from scientific point of view.
Not questionable. So what would be, what does valid mean, do you think, in that?
Valid, which is based on scientifically grounded, solid data, and can be on reliable methodology.
Reliable methodology, good, yes. Great, thank
Can
you.
be maybe also replicated in other place or other time, so it
Yep, thank you. Anybody else want to say anything about that? Stu?
It's correlated with whatever you think you're trying to indicate.
Right.
So you might have a line that's going up and shows that your indicator is increasing, but if that's not actually telling you anything about what the underlying process is that you're trying to indicate, then it's not terribly useful.
Yes. So if I was just to go back up to some of these questions and the use of this data here, this data on change in forest area, you might question sometimes whether it's scientifically valid, as it were, to use this data on forest area to answer some of these questions. The relationship between the data and the question is not very clear. It's not a valid hypothesis, if you like, of what change in this data means for this question. And also, as you said, that whether the data is valid. Thank you. So then another question for a factor for a successful indicator is based on available data. That there is data that you can use to produce the indicator. Yes, there have been many indicators that you would like to have, but if you don't have data for it, it's not successful, at least to start with. And that is responsive to change in the issue of interest. So anybody? So that means that if what you're looking for, if your question, like if you want an indicator about the status of a threatened species, does the indicator, so like I gave the example of forest cover as an indicator of the status of forest-dependent species, but there may be, that may be not very responsive, forest cover may not be very, as an indicator, very responsive to the change in the status of those species if there are other things happening to those species like hunting. And that it's easily understandable by the people who use the indicator. If it's too complicated, or if the idea behind the indicator of what it's measuring is too difficult to understand, it's not going to be successful. And it's relevant to users' needs. So that's a key thing, that it meets what the user wants. So you need to work out who is the user of this indicator. We'll be doing that in the exercise. Is it the Environment Minister? Is it an indicator for reporting to international convention? Is it for the news media? Or is it for local communities? Is it relevant to their needs? And of course, it's used. That's what bottom line for a successful indicator is, that it is used. Sometimes there are nice studies and proposals for indicators, lists of indicators in strategy documents, but they never actually get to be used for whatever reason. So a successful indicator is one that's actually used in a real world situation. And finally, we recommend that a successful indicator has an owner or champion. So somebody who says, we are responsible for this indicator. We are going to make sure that it is calculated, that it is reported, that it is used. Very often there are strategies and recommendations for indicators, but actually nobody is responsible for them. an indicator has an owner or a champion, whether it's the government agency, whether it's a non-government organisation or whatever, then it will be produced consistently over time, we hope. For example, with IUCN here, they have produced the Red List Index. So it's called the IUCN Red List Index. IUCN developed it, they champion it, they own it, they make sure that it's good quality and that it's produced and communicated effectively. So in your countries, for your indicators, look at, well, who is actually going to be responsible for it? I like the idea of champion. Somebody who says, this is important, we want to make sure that it's produced and used. And, yes.
Can I ask a question? Because the one issue that we've been grappling with is has been a tendency to use pressure state response indicators. I'm not sure quite how this fits in. But the concern is that if it's not complete, so if you only have a pressure indicator without a state indicator, then you kind of only tell half the story and it's quite uninformative. So I was just wondering if that does it fit in. I mean, I don't particularly like pressure state response indicators, but it's just that's been a real issue that we've been grappling with. Is how do you deal with that? Do you have to have a complete picture, or do you have just half the picture?
Yeah, I think it comes back to being really clear about what you want the indicators for. Sort of what is it? Where are you in the decision-making process? Is it for understanding an issue? Indicators can help you understand what's going on, generally give you the picture, so pressures on biodiversity, state of biodiversity, response measures to biodiversity helps you understand perhaps the picture and how things fit together a bit. So indicators are tools to help you with that. Or is it more actually what you've agreed to target, or you've agreed a policy and you want to measure the progress towards that? So then the indicator is more just specific for that purpose. Stu, do you want to help me out here?
I would say that half the picture is better than no picture at all.
Yes.
But if you really want to change policy and see the impacts of that on biodiversity on the ground, then you do need that big picture, and it's got to have a number of different elements. Whether you put it into 3 boxes of state pressure response, or 5 boxes, or 4 boxes, or some other framework, doesn't really matter, so long as you can explain how the suite of indicators relates to each other, and it covers everything from the change in the actual policy, the action on the ground, the change in biodiversity, and the reduction to whatever it was that was causing your problem to biodiversity in the first place. I mean, to be honest, there's probably very few sectors, either globally or at a national scale, where we've got really good indicators for all those different elements and understand the linkages between them. There's a lot where you have to just assume that if you're measuring fisheries pressure and the fisheries pressure goes down, then your biodiversity will respond, or some other equivalent of that. But the ideal would be to have a number of indicators that do fit together.
Yeah, and I think also, as Stu said, sort of half indicators is better than no indicators. And in terms of building capacity and having indicators increasingly being used, what we recommend is start with a few simple ones, produce those, and demonstrate the benefits from having those indicators. You can start with obvious things like coverage of protected areas or coverage of forests, but produce consistent indicators that people and demonstrate the value of that information, and demonstrate the value of indicators, and then be more ambitious with that. But in some places, the job is actually to build what I might call a culture of using indicators as part of policy making, of developing strategies. And so start with something simple at first to demonstrate the value of indicators. and then get support for doing further ones. Is that okay to answer your question? So, just quickly, multiple purposes of indicators. Yes, track progress in achieving targets, like the Aichi targets, guide policy design and implementation, highlight where action is needed. They're part of adaptive management. And build support. Effective use of indicators helps you build support for your issues, like the status of forests or species or whatever it is. Indicators are communication tools that help simplify perhaps more complex information. And so you can also have your indicators be a key part of getting support for your work. So, now I'm just going to introduce this framework. As I say, please look at the the inside page of your guidance documents. The inside cover, there's this framework. So I'm just going to introduce this, then we're going to learn more about it. So our aim this afternoon is to introduce you to this framework and to this guidance material so that hopefully you can use it when you go back home. It's something we've developed over a few years, tested in different workshops, and it covers 10 steps that we found that help you be successful in producing biodiversity indicators. You don't have to do all the 10 steps, but the more of them that you can cover, we think the more likely you are to be successful. And this guidance document it's got two parts. Section 1 is covering some of the material I just talked about, like what is an indicator. Section 2 explains each of the 10 boxes on here. So, for example, if you were to go to page 14 and 15, please. Page 14 and 15, identify and consult stakeholders and the target audience. So that explains that step, that box. So there's more information about what that means, and at the end it says questions to ask during this step. So as has already been said, the first part of developing indicators is identify and consult the stakeholders. Who is the indicator for? Find out what they want so that you can design an indicator to meet their needs so that it's successful. So then each of the next sections of the guidance document has 2 pages on those steps. So this framework has got 3 broad parts to it. In red, what we call purpose. So remember I said indicators are purpose dependent. So the first step is work out what is your purpose. Why do you want your indicator? And there are these 4 steps involved in that. In red, identify and consult your stakeholders and audience, as I said, and at the same time identify management objectives and targets. So in this case, targets are the global framework of Aichi targets and setting national versions to national targets to lead you down to determine key questions and indicator use. So you want to come up with a definition of the use of your indicator. What are the questions that are being asked? And have indicators to help you do that. And in parallel with that is a box called Develop Conceptual Model, which unfortunately we don't have time to look at very much today, but there is explanation here in the guidance on that. Developing a conceptual model of the subject that you're dealing with, which really helps in understanding the issue and identifying the indicators. Then The blue or purple section is about the production of the indicators. So we say once you've got clear of what your purpose is, identify possible indicators to help you meet that purpose, a kind of wish list. What would be the ideal that we would like to have in terms of indicators to answer this key question, to meet these needs. But at the same time, you need to gather and review the data that exists, so that you have a combination between ideally what you want and then the reality of what data do you have. What data could you work on a bit more to give you the indicator. So the arrow there goes up and down between those two stages because it's backwards and forwards between your possible your ideal indicators and the data you have, to then come down to calculator indicators and communicator and interpreter indicators. So that's the production part of it. And then there are two green boxes which we call permanents. We want your indicators to not be produced just once, but consistently over time, to help you report progress as part of adaptive management